The proceeding will start shortly. 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 The proceeding will start shortly.
Thank you for coming to help us with this inquiry today. Also welcome to what we often refer to as members of public, but shall I say interested observers. You're most welcome to. If I might start by asking you to introduce yourself from my left, so we get it on record. And if you then wanted to make an opening comment, please do so before we start asking you some questions that might help us with this inquiry. Can I start with you, please?
Thank you. So I'm Jeremy Watts. I'm a Professor of Engineering Systems at University College London and Vice Dean of Engineering there. I'm also concurrently the Chief Scientist and Engineer at the Building Research Establishment, BRE, so I split my time between those two. Previously, I spent some time with Arup as their Research Director. I was also in government as a Chief Scientific Advisor to the Department of Communities and Local Housing, Communities and Local Government, as I should say now. And I've spent my life as a practicing engineer before academia, so I came from the sort of manufacturing sector in electronics and moved into academia more recently. I also served as President of the Institution of Engineering and Technology last year, which was a formative and interesting thing to do. So I come to this, actually, the whole challenge space, I suppose, from the point of view of inter- and multidisciplinarity. I think the concepts around construction, we can draw some interesting analogies between different sectors, sectors that we believe perform well in, if you like, cost and risk management. And I might cite the electronics industry, the chip manufacture and so on, where there's a very tight supply chain, both in terms of knowledge that's shared up and down it, and also open book policies with respect to technology and costs. So, for example, you'd find that people who are competitive in marketplaces share common technology platforms, understanding industry associations that are very strong and set research agendas and so on. So it's interesting to... sorry, am I audible okay? Sorry, yes.
Speak up a bit.
Okay, yeah. So I think for the construction industry, we've got a fantastic opportunity to transfer some of the culture as well as technology across from some of the more well-formed manufacturing industries to replace some of the craft activity and the fitting at the last minute, if you like, in buildings where things aren't necessarily designed precisely before they're assembled. The assembly sequence and pattern, if you like, at a systems level is not prescribed exactly in many cases. We can transfer some of that information across and use digital methodologies which are
questions to come up. That it was basically about whether you wanted to make a short statement about yourself in the Bible.
I'm sorry. Okay, sorry. I thought you meant about the problem. Yes.
No, thank you very much. But I don't want you to have to repeat again when we ask the questions. Thank you.
So I'm Professor Jennifer Whyte. I'm a professor at Imperial College in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering. I've got a Royal Academy of Engineering Lang O'Rourke chair in systems integration. And I also lead a centre for systems engineering and innovation that has themes around production systems, infrastructure interdependencies, and life cycle of infrastructure. I'm involved in the Alan Turing Institute Lloyd's Register Foundation programme on data-centric engineering, and I'm a co-curator of the World Economic Forum Engineering and Construction Transformation Map.
Thank you.
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Phil Wilbraham. And many thanks for inviting me here this afternoon to talk a little bit about how in fact Heathrow Airport is using off-site manufacturing. I've worked at Heathrow for about 20 years. I'm currently the Heathrow Programme Director for Expansion, which means I'm accountable for delivering the third runway and all the infrastructure that goes with it. Before that, I led the construction on Terminal 5. I worked on that project for 10 years, and then I led the construction on Terminal 2. I'm a civil engineer. I'm also involved with Constructing Excellence, where I'm a co-chair. I'm also co-chair of a thing called I3P, which is Infrastructure Innovation, an infrastructure innovation pool. My real interest at the moment is the third runway at Heathrow and how we can do more off-site manufacturing. We can use our logistics hubs, which we're intending to set up 4 of them around the country, to consolidate loads, to assemble things which have been made in factories around the hubs, and to bring things efficiently to Heathrow, to basically reduce the number of people we need actually constructing an assembly at Heathrow, but also to ensure that we use the full supply chain around the country as we expand Heathrow.
Thank you very much. Now, if I might kick off with the first question. The question is, what factors makes people decide that the construction of anything could be off-site, or a major part of it could be off-site? And who makes that crucial decision when you have architects, civil engineers, and others involved? What is it that makes them choose off-site?
So, do you want to take...
Whatever way you like.
Okay, so for me, I guess my first immediate stab at that would be, well, where you've got a regularity and standardisation, if you like, in the item you're constructing from modular sub-elements, where there's a cost saving, and it might be the architect, but it might equally be the engineer who recognises the opportunity to the client of off-site manufacture for cost and risk reduction.
Well, I think clients play a big role here, and Phil will expand on that, I'm sure. With off-site manufacture, it's really important that you have the manufacturing expertise brought in earlier in the process. And so design work's, I think it's inefficient when design work's been done and then it has to be done again. And so you end up doing it once in situ and then with an off-site methodology. And so really important, I think, for off-site manufacturing is bringing that expertise around how things are made, how they're manufactured, how they're assembled earlier in the process.
So I would completely agree with that. It's really important to have an early decision that one is going to use some off-site manufacture. And that decision probably comes from the client or the client's representative. So either the client themselves or the project manager, the program manager, etc. And because it's so important, the first stage of the design is then carried out with off-site manufacture in mind. Because otherwise designers will generally design the way they've always designed and will get the same answer, to be honest. So it's really important to brief the designers to think about how they're going to design in a component-led way, because the real win here is if components are made in factories and they're the same again and again and again, and those components can be produced and used as then the building or the civil engineering infrastructure is actually constructed and assembled on site. So early decision making, probably client or project manager involvement, and there will be then pull sometimes from the engineer, the architect, supply chain when they've done this before. But I think at the moment, because it is still quite a new idea, that it needs some input early from the client. And I think then on a major piece of infrastructure, probably some targets need to be set to enable the teams to understand that this is important and that they need to go after it. And of course, the reason why we're doing this is to ultimately reduce costs, reduce time, but also to get better quality and better health and safety, because it is safer to make things in factory than it is to make them on site.
Lord Fox and then Lord Hunt.
At the moment, would you say that scale is perhaps the driver at the moment for considering off-site manufacture, in that making it on-site becomes much harder if it gets bigger? And is there also a political dimension? I mean, I don't want to drag you into the particular thing that you're involved in, but clearly spreading across a supply chain is possible when you do off-site. So is there a political consideration and a scale consideration which tend to be the drivers at the moment?
There are both those drivers. I mean, scale is really important because if we deliver Heathrow's expansion the same way we delivered Heathrow's Terminal 5 and Terminal 2, we will be looking after about 15,000 colleagues on site at peak during the construction. At Terminal 5 we got up to about 8,000 or 9,000. We don't think that is a sensible scale to be operating a construction site. So therefore, to reduce that scale, we need to do more work in different places. So one of our drivers is to reduce the scale of what we actually do on the construction site. And
to declare my interest, can I remind my colleagues that when you speak for the first time, declare your interest, and you don't have to do it again after that. I should have said, declare my interest. I have no interest to declare in relation to this inquiry. Lord Hunt.
I belatedly say I have no interest related to this inquiry.
Yes, as regards interest, I'm a fellow of the Royal Society and I'm an honorary fellow of the ICE, and I have a consulting company. And I just wanted to say I did some research at the BRE back in the 1970s on how people got blown over when they went near tall buildings, so I have a connection. But what I was surprised about your reply, your three replies, is that neither of them said, this is what I thought you might have done, was that with off-site you may be able to be more accurate and you may be able to do things that are more complex and different to what you do just doing it on-site. I wonder whether you'd like to comment on that.
Yes, I think for me that was in the risk reduction. It was rolled into the more predictable assembly, if you like. And certainly, as you say, at BRE, we've got some examples of domestic buildings that have been built off-site, assembled very quickly. And in a visit we had the other day, visitors observed there were cracks in the traditionally built buildings after 3 months, but actually the ones that were made off-site, they were fitting perfectly exactly because the pieces were designed according to manufacturing techniques. So I completely agree with you on accuracy and repeatability, and I think that reflects in risk and cost reduction.
Lord Maxton.
Yes, obviously in building the third runway, that is your major concern. But you have other clients as well. I mean, I've jokingly heard airports described as shops with runways.
Yes.
So you obviously have other clients. How do they fit into the overall pattern of constructing?
So you're absolutely right. So there are other companies that build things at Heathrow, develop, whether it's shops or hotels and those sorts of things. What we do currently is we require them to use some of our methods and encourage them to use some others. So, for instance, at the moment, we have a logistics hub at Heathrow. Colnbrook Logistics Centre is where we consolidate things at Heathrow. And if you're building a hotel, for instance, at Heathrow, you have to use our logistics system so that we know what's coming on and off site. Because the criticality again at Heathrow is we've got 78 million passengers being served there, and so there's a huge operation, and the building of the hotel or runway cannot get in the way of that operation. So we need to control trucks on and off the site at Heathrow. So we do that through consolidating loads, and so we will in that situation we'll ask our partner to work with us. And in the future, with our logistics hubs around the country, what we want to do is share that knowledge and encourage people to use those. So if there's a better way of building a hotel by making more of it in the Midlands or whatever, then hopefully that will then be used by the people who'll come along as our partners to actually develop the rest of the infrastructure.
Thank you. I'd like to ask what you feel are the main drawbacks to our off-site manufacture for construction.
Okay, so I think in the first instance there will be a cost element because we haven't yet got the economies of scale, if you like. I think there are issues around standardisation, reuse versus bespoke pieces, and there's a whole scale, I think, of cost benefits and potential disadvantages there. But in the long term, when the whole system is geared up to do this as a norm, I think there are very few disadvantages.
Transportation, isn't that sometimes a problem?
Well, indeed, again, but going back to BRE, I think there was one particular building that was put up which required 60-ton loads, which were too large for some of the motorways, so we had to choose the route. But that's a case of systems design, or how do you break it down? What's the granularity, if you like, of the modularity you're seeking? And in fact, the smaller you get it, think of Lego blocks, the more flexible you can be, in fact, with the solution. I think also manufacturing close to the point of consumption, as was said there by Phil, is absolutely key. So we don't want to have one big factory off-site in the middle of the country and then the overloaded infrastructure. We actually need to put those. Some of them are so-called pop-up factories these days, so some domestic buildings, for example, from Bill Dunster's Z factory, they will put up a temporary manufacturing unit for domestic and then take it down again when they've finished the...
I see, that's interesting.
So I hope I've answered some of those questions.
Yes,
I think
so.
okay.
I mean, I think the opportunities outweigh the drawbacks, and so there's a lot of opportunities around safety of workers, quality assurance, speed, productivity, reduction of waste, more traceability of materials. I think that there's a need to do off-site well, and so there's a need to make decisions up front and to get tolerances right, so that when things come to be assembled on site, they fit together. There's a need to consider maintenance and maintainability. And so all of these push us to think through the life of assets at that early phase, so that when we're putting buildings together, then we have an idea about how we're going to get into bits of the building to maintain it. And I think that all pushes towards designers needing a greater understanding of manufacturing, assembly, maintenance and operation activities, so that they can consider these up front in design. And I completely agree that that's partly about thinking in terms of components and thinking in terms of platform approaches to design. And we're seeing some very good innovative thinking about that in the sector at the moment. So Bryden Wood, for example, has done some work with Centre for Digital Built Britain on that. In the Centre for Systems Engineering and Innovation that I lead, then we've got research looking at design for manufacture and assembly and the processes needed to ensure that designers appreciate materials, maintenance and operation phases. an example of that is actually on the Heathrow Terminal 5 roof sub-project. We did quite a lot of research on that. And that was really a location where I saw designers and subcontractors working together to understand materials and therefore being able to use standardised products but also be quite innovative in the way that they thought about them and put them together.
So one example of where potential drawback is that the factory will work at a particular speed and then the construction site works. So that there has to be really good logistics between the site and the factory and the hub or whatever. So because the factory will want to work at the speed it wants to work at to be efficient, to make it basically cheaper. But then you've got to then tie that in with how fast you can build on site. So there's extra logistics, I would say, and I think construction becomes about logistics and assembly, if you like, rather than the sort of traditional construction, and where actually there's lots of people doing their different trades, as Jeremy was saying earlier, on site. So we do need to change the skill set of people understanding it's about logistics and assembly rather than about trades coming to site to sort of finish things off.
That leads nicely to Baroness Morgan's question. Lord Griffiths first.
To what extent do you think that architects are part of the drawback in the following way? If you think of successful private companies who can splash out, say, the tech giants on new campuses and so on, they're going to attract the best architects who are going to make statements. On the other hand, if you're constructing a public sector building and the taxpayer is really ultimately financing it, and you're subject to the audit office and so on, to what extent do you think that in the end this engineering process actually will drive a wedge between these two worlds?
Well, I think architecture has to be viewed, if you like, on a scale. At one end you've got the signature architects, the Fosters of this world, and we admire their work, they're wonderful. At the other end you've got the real pragmatic architects, if you like, who are doing, as you say, the public works, but even domestic buildings, etc. And the signature end, going back to my Arab days, are a little bit averse to anything that drives the way they design things. It's their idea, it has to be really uniquely theirs. But actually, as you reduce the granularity, if you like, of the modular approach, so you get to more and more flexibility. And in fact, in Japan, there are examples of high-rise blocks which use the same, if you like, flat pre-assembly, but actually offset by a certain number of degrees. So as you go up the building, you get the sort of corkscrew effect, and it doesn't look like a prefabricated approach. So I think with a pragmatic approach to architecture, somewhere on that scale, you'll have architects who'll adopt that and actually probably quite celebrate it and say, we are into modular construction, we're proud of this, we're experts in this area. At the other end, I think there will probably be a slow transition. But actually there are interesting changes, if you like, and I guess Jennifer can speak to this. So modern computer-aided design tools which drive building information modelling allow parametric design, so you can actually take a design feature and then adapt it in scale or rotation or whatever and create sub-assemblies you can make from that. So in fact that is quite close to what architects are liking to do. And there was another point that I thought you raised that was very interesting and one I hope we have a chance to talk about a bit later, and that is the concept of in-life total cost, not just capital cost versus running cost. And ownership models, of course, drive minimum capital cost and then never mind how much it costs to run. So as Jennifer said, maintainability is really key. And if you can build in instrumentation and sensors now, we've got digital Internet of Things, we can actually tell how well the building's working and maybe arrange contracts. I hesitate to use the words PFI here, but a sanitised version of PFI, which actually feeds back the performance of the building to allow a contract to be satisfied.
And then look Baroness Morgan.
It strikes me we're not waiting for anything to be invented to make this happen. We're not... people have, prefabs existed a long time ago. So what on earth has stopped this from happening in the natural stroke market way? Is it the balkanisation of the construction industry? Is it snobbishness about prefabs? Is it what? What is the major impediment?
I would argue that it's that you cannot change technologies of production without changing business and procurement models. Right? And we've known that for a while. Joan Woodward was doing work on that in Imperial in the 1950s. And Yeah.
Can I follow up on that?
Yeah.
If it is to do with procurement and this, that and the other, I mean, why is it that the UK seems to be behind the race versus a number of other countries? Is there a differential in terms of the procurement in, say, Japan or Germany or whatever, and ourselves, or is there planning agreements, or you know, what makes us behind the race?
So I think it's the way you set up your project, your program at the start. Procurement's a part of it, but you need to set up such that you've got a team around you who understand that things can be done in this way. You need some technical input early so that you can understand that things can be done differently. Because otherwise people will follow the traditional route. And the traditional route of our procurement means that you do generally a little bit of design and then another designer comes along and they follow the traditional route. I'd also say as you go back into what we're taught at university, etc., generally we're taught to do things in situ and on site. So there is an education piece here as well about, it's not just, we can't turn a tap as a client from going on site to off site. There needs to be in the supply chain an understanding of what that means as well. So I think there's a number of things, but a good starting point is a client who wants to do things a slightly different way, but then get the right technical experts around them such that then the procurement can follow at the right pace, the right way. I don't think there's anything from our perspective which procurement ultimately stops this change. It's a matter of small changes on all sorts of things.
But is there any other country that has got it right?
So I would say that there are pockets of excellence in the UK as there are elsewhere. So we had the Singaporean building BCA brought their construction industry over to Imperial precisely to learn about design for manufacture and assembly and integrated digital delivery. Now Singapore itself does a lot of this, yeah. But they recognise that there are excellent projects in the UK. The question is, given that there are people doing this, why is everybody else not following? Yeah? And that is a question about business models, about procurement models that really enable this.
Morgan.
Thank you. I should declare my interests. I'm a non-executive director of Countryside Properties PLC and vice chair of King's College. We've already touched on some of this. It'd be really useful if you could really expand for us on the issue of skills and what's the skill set in what we're talking about. How different is the skill set from the traditional skill set? And where are the gaps in the new skill set? Where are the gaps, or where are the opportunities? I mean, what's the good and the bad, in a sense, in the story of the gaps that we have currently in skills and what we would have for the future model?
Shall I go first?
Okay. Yeah.
So I think we've come from a world of craft and fitting. So there was a time of manufacturing when we built steam engines and locomotives where things weren't built precisely and things went together. You had to file a bit and then sort of adjust. So tolerances weren't really understood in the same way. We're still there really with construction at the moment, I think. And what we'll see is a diminution, if you like, of the fitting element, because as other colleagues said, well, you did, I think, Jennifer, if the tolerances are right, things will just fit together. Of course, it could be disastrous if the tolerances aren't right, because we still have fitting and modular construction. You really have to have it right first time. So I think the skills, there'll be a migration more towards design. Maybe some of the manual skills will go into these regional factories where they can still be used in a similar way, but equally there'll be an upskilling, I think, towards systems engineering and design.
So we believe that systems engineering is important in this new environment, and so we're beginning to look at providing CPD around systems engineering out of Imperial and through UCRIC, which is the UK Collaboratorium, which does research on infrastructure in cities. I would say that there's also some fundamental, there's a need for a fundamental research base here as we move to more digital fabrication techniques. And so there's opportunities around technologies like AI and robotics as we move forward, that I think it's important that we have the research base to support. So it's not a one-off transition in a sense. There's a transition that's required, and that's about business models, procurement models. But I think there's also the skill base that's going to support advanced manufacturing approaches to construction as we move forward into 2030, 2040, 2050.
How do you think we get young people who are currently at school, how do we excite them in thinking about this future? I ask it particularly because I've got to go early to go and speak to something about women in STEM, so I'm just wondering if there's something I can take from here. But I mean, seriously, it strikes me that in many ways this is potentially attractive to people who aren't currently attracted to this, to the industry. I wonder if there's any evidence of that yet, and what are the lessons for how we try and encourage young people at an early age to think about this?
I mean, I think the built environment is extremely exciting to young people, and they get the idea that this is about their houses, the roads that they walk on, the schools that they go to. You know, if they're unlucky enough to go to hospital, then the hospitals that they go to. So they understand that this is really about the world that they live in, and I think that the opportunity to make that at a higher level of quality. And to be able to think through how we put that together and how we operate it and maintain it long term is exciting to young people. So I think there's real opportunity to excite them about this.
So I think user-centric design is really interesting, isn't it? As you bring the user into the simulation of what it's going to be, so that there's much more creativity associated with the process rather than just being delivered and not being quite what you expected.
And there's a lot of cool technology that can play into that, right? So the artificial intelligence, the robotics, are cool areas of technology that start to begin to connect with this world.
I think the other side of this is that we still spend too much time explaining what fun it's to be on a construction site. That isn't the point, really. The point is that actually there's some really interesting work to create something which is then extremely easy to build. And that's the bit up in that, the sort of first stages of the work, rather than pictures on magazines of people in hard hats, which is what we still seem to trade. And I think we need to stop trading that, and actually people creating things on screens would be a much better way to try to explain to my kids anyway, that it's not all about muddy boots and those.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks.
You didn't seem to be answer at all the question, what's wrong with the UK in this building? I mean, the French are building twice or even 3 times as many houses as we are. One of the arguments is that in France, and I've been on committees of this, looking at the French nuclear. I mean, they have centralised teams, or they have the organisation Point Chaussee for the roads. I mean, do you not think that, in fact, that the top structure, the planning structure, the organisational structure of the UK just doesn't match to this pretty efficient system you've got in France, where the houses come out and they're built and they don't fall down. Had my wife designed our own one in France. It works very good, but you haven't answered that question. You said there are expertise here and there and so on. But
that's a political question, though, I think, that one, isn't it? Because it reflects back to Napoleon's time. Napoleon did some good things.
So tell us what you think.
Well, I think that centralised policy, when I was in DCLG as their chief scientist, we had regional spatial planning. So actually, somebody had a global idea of how the UK should be laid out. That seemed like a good idea to me, unpolitically, just from a rational point of view. But if you've got linear assets like rail lines to build, then you plan that holistically. It's a tiny country we've got after all, so why wouldn't we think holistically? I think that mapped out into the rest of the space we're discussing really articulates some of the problem. We need to have, in my view, some sort of centralised pull towards some of these outcomes.
Does that correspond with your idea of comparing the UK with other countries?
In as much as I know a lot about other countries, which is not as much as colleagues, I'm sure, but I mean, if you look at the extreme of China, nobody wants to have their political system. Nevertheless, they do achieve some amazing projects using off-site manufacturing, presumably in infrastructure, for example, at very high rates. Obviously, they have access to huge amounts of finance. That's the other key thing. I think for us, we just need to get a more coherent view collectively of where we're heading in a way. That's our response to it. And making sure that we do have the investment available to create the momentum.
I think that's a key point, because there needs to be enough of this, particularly in the civil engineering and infrastructure, where it is then worthwhile for people to invest in their factories such that there is throughput, because the price will only come down if there is throughput. And that, so there's a sort of circle here, a virtuous circle. If we get started on this and we encourage people to use off-site manufacture, then the factories will be created, then the factories will fill, and then everyone will realise that's a cheaper and quicker and safer way of doing it, and then it'll move. But it will take a big push, and it takes the bigger clients, government clients, to be honest, are the big clients in that situation, and they're the ones that need to, I think, help us to get to a point where these factories then become efficient. Because if there isn't efficiency in the factory, this won't be cheaper, and we'll go back to doing it the way we've always done it.
I think what's been argued is, what is the planning problem? That is a problem, is it? The planning permissions are not being given.
I think there's enough knowledge of the infrastructure workload now. It takes a long time to come through, and I think it's then key that the government, the in fact public sector clients that look after that have a will to actually move to this type of way of doing it, because it won't come from a private sector client doing something different, because, to be honest, everyone else will carry on as they are. So I mean, with our 4 logistics hubs, we're talking to other programs with an aim of those programs coming with us on that journey, so the hubs become really busy and the factories around them become really busy. So that's fairly early work, but we're keen to make sure that this actually gets embedded and becomes a legacy.
I should declare my interest. I don't have any interest.
Baroness Young.
Could I declare my interest as Chancellor of Cranfield University and Chairman of the Woodland Trust, who have an interest in wooden buildings, and Honorary Fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh? Lord Griffiths stole my question, so I dreamt up another one, and then you answered it before I could even get that far. So I'm left with the sort of scrapings of what I want to ask. And it's really about this business of scale-up. I mean, where are we on the trajectory of scale-up? Are we really tiny, and it's going to need an exponential increase to get to these levels of efficiencies in the off-site manufacturing process? Or are we halfway there? Or, where are we on the kind of growth curve? And secondly, the idea of government as a driving client. Because personally, my experience of public sector buildings of various sorts is that government's only too keen to step back and let some other agency run with the design concepts, because they really don't want to have the egg on their face if it all goes horribly wrong. So what do we need to do to get government to really act as a large-scale responsible client to help drive this? And should that be in public sector, commercial buildings, non-housing, or is housing a good place to start?
For me, I mean, it is where we have the real gap, isn't it? I think in capacity against the objectives that government has been massively underperforming there. And there is quite a lot of investment going on in various house building companies, which are in some of the case studies that we submitted, showing that they have been able to demonstrate benefits. We have at BRE got a number of houses that are built on site, full-scale houses people live in to try them out, and that kind of works. So the type of off-site manufacture can be quite small scale. It can be done in pop-up factories or in small local units. That contrasts, I guess, with, say, Lang O'Rourke, who've got a Steatley factory, haven't they, working on very large concrete reinforced structures, very specialist ones, more bespoke. So there's a whole spectrum. That's probably less advanced, but some companies are at leading edge. At the housing end, we're probably just a procurement gap away from doing much more of it, because it's not that difficult, perhaps, to set up. I think there was, some other interesting points you raised about the government's interventions, and those of you who've looked at building information modelling BIM, which of course is mandated as of April, was it last year, or there or before? So for government procurement above £5 million worth has to use building information modelling, which is an essential ingredient for what we're talking about today, but it isn't a necessary, it's an essential agreement, but it doesn't specify off-site manufacture in itself. But the point there is that procurement rules, I think, can be very effective. Now, the residual question around procurement was, when I started thinking about it, sounds great, government procures against certain requirements. Will the private sector follow? Will shareholders of public companies say, government's doing this, so why aren't we doing it? I don't see much evidence of that at the moment, and I think that deserves some research and understanding.
Can I follow that just a little? Let's stick on the private sector just for a moment. I mean, on the basis of it, what we're saying here is that off-site manufacturing of houses can be cheaper and better. Okay, right? So you would think that if the market was operating as markets usually do, and you can produce something which is cheaper and better, and there's no demand for it apparently, or no supply of it, then what's standing in the way? This is the bit that I don't really understand.
So I would argue that the forward understanding of the work pipeline is really important here because of the upfront cost of investing in the facilities to produce off-site. And so, I mean, we do start to see some volumetric production in the house building industry. But that forward understanding of pipeline is really crucially important when you're putting in that capital investment around.
But if the demand is there at the end user, in other words, you've got something which is cheaper and better, therefore there should be the demand, why doesn't the production follow it? I mean, or if you're putting any new product in, you have to take the risk of building a factory to produce it. That is a risk, and that's part of the game. It's like any manufacturing game. And I don't see the difference here. I can't see quite what's holding this back, unless it is a whole concatenation of architects, different trades, public sector procurement, planning, whatever. I mean, is it in that area?
I think probably planning and development. Developers sitting on land and not developing, doing that sort of thing. The marginal, if that's the right term, the risk, the cost of the risk. Why would I take the risk when I know I can build it? With a team of people doing craft and fitting, not having a perception necessarily of the extra margins. I mean, the construction sector has been living with tiny margins for years, I think. So actually the culture...
Is there a prejudice against prefabs going back to the early days, the post-war days? Is that part of that atmosphere of caution?
I haven't perceived it personally, but I haven't necessarily been working in the right sector to perceive the client view. But I do reflect on the fact we don't like wooden frame buildings like they have in the US, which are essentially prefabbed, aren't they, of a panel. We like brick-built buildings culturally. But you can actually still have brick-built buildings with brick facades that look just like a house off-site manufactured.
I would say something about skill sets there as well, the availability of the skill set to deliver in this way.
Fox and then Lord Griffiths.
Professor Watson, you helpfully provided a briefing before this meeting, which is an on-the-record document, and in it, under government actions, you say there may be no immediate burning platform to change technology. In what you just said, you were talking about massive underperformance in building housing, and we know that to be true. So what constitutes a burning platform if massive underperformance in house building is not a burning platform?
I was thinking from a business point of view, from the point of the house builders. They may not see anything that drives them. That this
well, I think that needs to be clarified, given this is an on-the-record document.
If there's a way that I can modify that and resubmit, I will do that. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I think now that you've said it...
I apologise.
No, it's not an apology.
No, I should apologise.
I didn't recognise the 2 points.
Lord Griffiths. And then come back.
Mr. Chairman, I should have acknowledged an interest, and that is that I was at one stage a mentor to someone on an executive development programme in Lang O'Rourke. Can I come back to Lord Vance's question, because I think it's really interesting. Because if, for example, I know you were in the retail business and you could see ahead a stream of income, you figured out what your costs would be and you could say, we either do it or we don't, but at least you... To what extent in this area, and since wanting to ask it, my colleague on my left said planning permission is much easier in the north than in the south. And I just wonder whether it's in a way the government intervention in the market through planning permission, which makes predicting a sort of medium to longer term demand much more difficult than it would be if you just had a normal market.
Is not the problem that the planning permissions are not given by governments, by central government, they're given by local governments?
That is true. Yes.
And because if I want to build a new conservatory on my house, I've got to go to a planning committee and get planning permission.
I would just reflect on, I think, what I said before in terms of there's value in taking a central view, obviously with the correct local democracy to balance that naturally. I think that's the point I would make there.
Can I go back to Lord Fox's excellent burning platform search? I feel the need for a burning platform. And I just wonder if the skills thing is going to become the burning platform. You know, I mean, everyone's predicting with Brexit that all these wonderful bricklayers are going to go back to wherever they came from, and that we're going to end up with a lack of the traditional construction skills. I mean, is that wishful thinking, or is that not going to be a burning platform?
I think it could very well be. Actually, I don't know whether we really truly appreciate that. Certainly, to be able to do the way what we're doing at the moment at the cost we're doing it won't be perhaps possible, because the wage expectations I think might be different between the different nationalities and so on. That could well become a margin driver for companies to have to look for ways of cost reduction. Certainly.
I think certainly in certain parts of the country that will become a driver, and already is. So at Heathrow we've started work with Lord Blunkett, who's running our skills task force for us. So what we're looking at is what will be the need for skills as we construct the new runway at Heathrow. And again, it's trying to look into the future, as we have been here, as what those skills will be, and then work out how we can create those skilled people basically around Heathrow. So working with the local education colleges, etc., to ensure that we're skilling people up the right way, so that they can they will be able to work at Heathrow in the future. And so I think if we all carry on as we are, that will ultimately. I don't think I think it's a simmering platform. So I need to be honest. I think at the moment we're still able to carry on as we are, and maybe it'll actually start really catch fire in about 10 years' time. It seems to keep on simmering, and people find ways of dealing with, if you like, sort of putting it out rather than it really takes light, if you like.
Is it the fact that it is the developers who effectively control supply that is keeping the platform from setting fire? Because actually, if the supply was to meet the need rather than the developer's ambition, then the platform would be on fire, because there wouldn't be the skills and there wouldn't be the supply chain in order to deliver the hundreds of thousands of houses we actually need. But the fact is, it's the developers who are maintaining control over the supply.
From my perspective, at Heathrow, we want to crack on develop as quickly as possible, and we will add fuel to the fire rather than. And so it's not my.
I believe that has been a major issue in housing, and I think government is looking at interventions to cause the release of land for development. But I agree with you, and if you had the step change in demand, then that would tend to drive, I think.
The only thing I'd like to add to that is that 10, 15 years ago, when I was in an innovative manufacturing research centre, we were looking at house building in terms of the sort of single family dwellings. And yet what I observe in terms of innovative approaches to house building in the UK at the moment is in these sort of multi-storey, student accommodation blocks, for example. So HTA designers doing some of the volumetric blocks in Wembley. It has the tallest volumetric, tallest modular building in Europe, and that's really where the innovation's happening in residential that's multifamily, that's of a reasonable height, that's in urban areas. And that's quite a different problem to crack than the kind of suburban problem.
Yeah, and then Lord Cake move on. Did you have a question?
I did, but I think it's been answered. Though I must admit, that last remark, I suddenly had Ronan Point in the back of my head, multi-modular, high-rise, North London. Are we better at it now, do you reckon?
I absolutely
You're probably
believe...
too young to remember what Rodent
No, I
was.
don't. Well, thank you for that. I mean, I take it as a compliment.
I'm thinking about your colleague, actually.
You're going to say, clearly I'm not.
Could I return to the question of research and development, and ask, you mentioned certain areas, AI, robotics and so on. What else might be needed in this area? And particularly, I'm interested in how much are the university departments doing in this area? How much of a focus is there on fundamental research to drive this area of economic activity? Are the research councils involved in it? Is UKRI going to have a lead role in this? Are there going to be challenge funds that focus on developing the knowledge base to develop this area and make it truly productive for our economy?
Obviously, Jennifer from Imperial, I'm from UCL. UCL and UCL East out at the Olympic Park, we've put up a large robotics laboratory which is actually sponsored by the Civil Environmental Geomatic Group, very interested in on-site automated construction from off-site manufactured pieces, if you like. So how do you actually put them together, which was a point we haven't really covered today. But for example, in Japan, to reduce injuries on site and to increase the speed of working, you can use robots very effectively for construction. Jennifer mentioned UCRIC, which I think is a £140 million investment the government made with match funding from industry, which is putting together the capital infrastructure to enable a number of universities, and Jennifer can articulate which ones, I'm sure, to put together a capability for doing research, and obviously Cambridge as well, across the patch in that sort of area. And I think under the Industrial Strategy Fund, obviously UKRI and others are playing a key part in connecting universities with research technology organisations like BRE and others to put together an integrated capability of people who understand the early technology readiness levels with those who could interpret technology into practice, and then the practitioners as well. So there's more that can be done, I'm certain of that, but actually government is getting it, I think, and perhaps we need to make sure that it is under some sort of collective umbrella that's being not so much managed as making sure communications happen so we don't reinvent wheels.
Okay, if I may, I should also have added at the beginning I have no interests to declare. In terms of the R&D you describe in our own country, how does that compare with global research effort in this area, and how competitive are we compared to others?
I mean, it's interesting because my focus has shifted east, I guess, and so I've been over in Hong Kong at their construction productivity event where they invited some of us over to talk to them. We've been hosting Singapore, and I think both Hong Kong and Singapore are doing substantial things in practice, but are also interested in this in a research capacity. So we work with Hong Kong University. There are interests in this area in Switzerland, where they're doing a lot of work on digital manufacturing. In Germany, there's a lot of good work being done on digital. In the US, of course, and I think, but the UK is seen as a leading player in digital. Because of the investment that the UK government has made to, as a client into Digital Built Britain.
And I think with building information modelling, if I interject, I mean, we are seen as the leader, or we were until very, very recently. And we were quite brave in the government procurement policy around building information modelling, which gives us actually, I think, a lead-in ramp, doesn't it? To being expert in off-site manufacturing.
And EPSRC has invested over many years in the manufacturing area, and so we have a capability in the universities. And indeed, some of that capability was built through the innovative manufacturing research centres that it funded 10 years ago now. And so there is capacity in terms of the research base, but I think it's really important to sustain that and refresh it towards that next generation of technologies.
And so what actions need to be taken to achieve exactly that, to refresh and to retain that established base?
Well, I think some of the actions are beginning to be taken through the Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund, and I was pleased to hear that there are calls coming out through EPSRC and through Innovate UK and through ESRC indeed, on the back of some of the larger investments, because I think it's important that there are small-scale experiments that are happening across the UK, and that those are a network and that they're coordinated in some way, but that there's the ability for some of the excellent researchers in universities across the UK to do work in this area and to help propel us forward.
Sorry, just one more, Lord Chair, if I may, sorry. Does any of this research effort in our universities, or indeed in industry more generally, depend upon European funding, or is it all specifically domestic funding?
No, absolutely. I used to be the UK representative on the European Construction Technology Platform, and we were seen as key leaders, thought leaders around the research area. We instigated a €2 billion public-private partnership on low-energy buildings called E2B, and I believe also a similar thing around infrastructure, which I wasn't part of, but which my colleague Terry Hill at Arup started. And then the UK benefited enormously from the funding that was available from, or still does, I guess, from, if you like, agendas that we'd helped to shape. And the partnerships with major companies, which we all know very well in the UK, like Bouygues and others, Acciona in Spain and so on, doing collaborative research and sharing outcomes. Thank you.
I was interested in what you just said, but of course one of the things that, again, this committee has looked at is that after Brexit we may participate in certain programmes, but we will lose our leadership role. I mean, you see this across the board. But what I was going to say was, I guess there's been a sort of implicit thinking about buildings and walls and so on. But of course, a hugely important part of housing is energy, and really most houses, new houses, small houses, have independent energy. Is that desirable? Or is that just because of individuals want to do it like that? And obviously the government is very concerned, we all are, about energy use. But actually the way we're doing it, by comparison, as I said, with German public housing, I mean, it's just quite different. And I wonder how you see that.
I think we're on the cusp actually of an amazing revolution, which at BRE we've demonstrated through building, I think there are 3 or 4 houses which have photovoltaics on the roof, but batteries. So we've heard about Tesla and the work that Elon Musk and Tesla batteries. With sort of 10 kilowatt hours of storage, which say in the south of England you can easily get on a sort of anything other than the darkest winter's day, you actually store the energy during the day when most people are out and use it in the evenings. So typically you can almost achieve zero energy imports. And actually when it's even sunnier, you can be exporting that energy. Now the feed-in tariff, of course, is very small. It's been reduced after those early heady days, whatever it was, nearly 40 pence a unit. But nevertheless, if you can actually use the energy you create, and these are all modular concepts, so modular roofs which actually have built-in photovoltaic cells that don't look like unsightly photovoltaics but look like roof tiles, those are available now. Cost-reduced energy storage and management, there's a long way to go there because the volume isn't there yet, but with the increase in the use of electric cars, that technology will come across into the built environment. We could see a real transformation in terms of distribution of energy and very much more autonomy and I would say resilience as well from the grid system, and also give the grid operators the flexibility to turn, to adjust the balance of power so they don't have to increase the rating of conductors.
Used for the energy systems as for basically putting together the beams and the concrete.
I think the assembly, say, of roofs would involve the inclusion of photovoltaic devices and built into prefabricated roofs, yeah. But not the semiconductor manufacturing, that's probably done somewhere else.
Box. You've mentioned en passant the industrial strategy, you've mentioned the Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund. A key element of the industrial strategy is sector deals. So what should be included in the construction sector deal in order to bring to fruition the promise that we see from off-site manufacturing?
Well, it's a hard question to answer because, of course, we don't have the sector deal draft in front of us. But
draft it.
but I think I would have to push the argument that it's important to have in that the higher skills agenda, and that's around PhD students, it's around the knowledge economy, it's around sustaining and developing capabilities to do to compete in our manufacturing processes, to be competitive in our manufacturing processes. Because we're not. I think the question about international comparisons was well made, because we're not the only country that's noticed the opportunities and the benefits of offsite.
I think I'd also cover the other end of the skills scale, so continuing professional development, the uplift of skills, the maintenance of skills, people changing their engineering jobs, if you like, to match the changing technology. That requires the professional institutions, the universities, to be offering out, perhaps by distance learning, ways of getting on top of these new technologies without taking huge amounts of time out of the working day. And I think the other thing for the Challenge Fund would be funding at scale serious demonstrators. We tend to build something that's not quite enough to convince everyone. Something that really you can't deny. Think about the O2 Stadium or something of that sort of scale that uses a particular approach and clearly demonstrates well-evidenced, measured benefits, which can then pull the momentum through the industry.
Yeah, please, Lord.
But it seems to me that rather than just a sort of sector deal here, you're really looking for a holistic strategy. I mean, you've got here issues which are governmental ones, of planning regimes, public procurement, etc., etc. Then you've got developers' motivation, various vested interests in threatened professions like architects and various trades as well. You've got an R&D and technology bit of it. You've got a whole host of stuff here. There's a risk that you end up, so I shouldn't be answering this question, there's a risk that you end up sorting some of the things that go naturally into a sector deal without taking the holistic view of the whole environment in which this thing operates. Is that right?
I think there is a lot to ultimately change. And with all change, it needs to be taken in bite-sized chunks. And I think the important thing is that the sector deal does pick up some of the points you made, because it probably won't pick them all up. But then ultimately people start using those things and then move on to the next point, because all that won't change in the next 5 years. It will be a steady process, and also we would want to bite off the things that are easier to do first. So it is easier to do off-site manufacture with relatively small bits of concrete and steel, and so do that really well as well, and prove that it works. Make it completely and utterly digital and works. So work on some bits that can really be done well. Prove they work on a normal site, if you like, in a normal development. So I agree with you. I think to try to solve all this in a one-er is not it. So we've got to pick bits off, and different people have got to attack different bits.
Yeah, but if you don't tackle the market deficiencies, because it seems to be full of market deficiencies, then no matter what you do elsewhere, you aren't going to crack it.
Yeah. Mayor, you wanted to come in.
Can I comment? I ought to declare my interests. I'm a Fellow of the Royal Academy of Engineering and of the Royal Society. I'm Emeritus Professor of Civil Engineering at Cambridge, and Laing O'Rourke collaborates with my university. I'm also President of the Institution of Civil Engineers, and I chair the Science Advisory Council of the Department of Transport, who are a major infrastructure provider. And I'm a consultant. I'm sorry, this won't take too long. And I should also say I'm a consultant to Laing O'Rourke, but I don't have any involvement with their off-site manufacture. I'm primarily consultant to them on underground matters, tunnelling and so on. My question is really about distinction between buildings and other forms of civil engineering infrastructure. And I think we've touched on that, and obviously, Phil, your world at Heathrow is not only about buildings and what you're currently addressing, but largely most of the discussion has been about buildings. And I'd just like to hear from the three of you about the potential for off-site manufacture in other forms of civil engineering infrastructure.
I think there is potential in civil engineering to be honest, just as much as there is in buildings. We have probably, in the past, done more in buildings, but if you go back to the Terminal 5 days, we determined that we should precast 60% of our concrete, which wasn't the actual flat concrete, all the other concrete. So we set a target, and we built river walls out of precast units. People say you would never do that, and a lot of people said we were mad, but we did it. Those river walls are still there 14 years later. They don't leak, and etc. So there's a mindset thing here as well as sort of, you know, proving the case. And certainly for civil engineering, I think it's so embedded that you design it, you do your reinforcement, you build it on site, etc. And we need to unembed some of that. And we will be certainly, with the civil engineering which we're about to embark on at Heathrow, we'll be setting targets about how much of it's going to be precast and how much, and whether that's precast in a factory or, as someone saw about earlier, we actually build a little factory near Heathrow and do it. There are different ways of doing it, or we build a little factory near one of our, in fact, logistics hubs. There's lots of different ways of getting at it. It will then encourage designers to think differently, and ultimately what you then get to is you get less wet trades on site and hopefully no hot trades on site, because that's where all the trouble comes, all the danger is, all the joints are, and where the problems come later in maintenance, etc. So I think in civil engineering there's massive opportunity actually, but I don't think it's been tapped into as much as in the buildings so far, because the buildings, it's sort of more obvious and you can sort of see bits of it, you know, on the back of trucks, and so and for a long time people have been, you know, trying to do their, in fact, M&E, they're in fact mechanical and electrical offsite, and we've done that, and you put them into, you know, big modules, and it's great, and then you plug it all together. But that's again still quite simplistic. There's a lot more we can do to bring together, you know, bits of buildings, and actually I was in Langerook's yard, and they've got whole bits of a side of a building coming out now, and you can see the bits of the building which are sitting in the yard ready to go to London, and they'll just be literally installed. And so I think, and that's a sort of combination between civils and buildings. So I think there's lots of, you know, the last car park we built at Heathrow, multi-storey car park, was 80% built in a factory, and so there you've got the same thing again and again and again, repetitive, and it's built much quicker, much safer, much higher quality, and ultimately it'll be cheaper. I think the cheaper thing, we need scale. It's back to the scale question. We need scale to get it cheaper.
If I may, Chairman, do you think in general that in terms of changing the mindset all around the country, that most of the mindset at present, if it is thinking at all about off-site manufacturing, it's thinking about buildings, and there are all sorts of other projects, local authorities, and which are not buildings, and that's really probably the biggest sort of barrier.
I think there's more progress in buildings. So if you say where we are on the scale, we're probably 10 to 20% in buildings, while we're 5 to 10% in civils. You see, and there's a great example on the A14 at the moment, where you know, a huge viaduct is being built alongside where it's actually being put up. So there are little pockets of the civil engineering world.
Yeah, I mean, I would have brought in examples from Crossrail, so Custom House and so on, are examples of prefabrication being used on major infrastructure projects. Yeah. I think both with buildings and infrastructure, there's the problem of how you sequence the people that you bring in to do the work. So I think if you bring designers in ahead of fabricators, then you can end up with an in situ solution that you're then trying to post hoc.
Can I first declare my interest as a property developer, mainly of housing sites, but also of other developments? Can I ask about public procurement yet again, because we've touched on it on several occasions. The November 2017 budget said that the government was going to encourage off-site construction, particularly in transport, health, Department of Education, Justice, Ministry of Defence. But they will all adopt a presumption in favour of off-site construction by 2019. How many of those do you think will actually achieve it?
I think it's good early signals, actually. So seeing the work that Bryden Wood's doing with the Ministry of Justice, which builds on the work that they've done with them around the digital built Britain. You know, and I think digital and off-site, they're not quite the same thing, but they often go hand in hand.
Indeed, yes.
Because they allow you to think about a building, or indeed about infrastructure, in terms of components, and then you can start to think about how you fabricate those. And so I think there's good early signals, if you like, that there's the potential at least for government departments to seize the opportunity for the efficiency savings and all of the benefits that we know off-site brings.
Good.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's very likely. I think probably that government does provide some very useful signposting, if you like, and I think the infrastructure of, say, research and capability can naturally ease a rather conservative and slow industry towards better places. I think also it's moving incrementally as well, because not only are we doing not off-site manufacture, but actually the component manufacturers are coming along quite well as well. So actually, you're starting to see the parts from which buildings are made being very much more accurately made, much more standardisation, repeatability and so on. So that's also driving, I think, so if you like, top down and also bottom up at the same time. So it's not such a bad position, I think, in that way, but some big projects will drive further through. One point, if I may, just because I didn't have a chance to respond to Lord Mayor, and that really is around infrastructure. I think, and you know much better than I do, but things like tunnel linings have been made for years in prefabricated off-site ways, and things like footbridges for motorways and all sorts of similar things. But one of the opportunities I think that emerges is that by tracking materials through their life, you can also do closed loop. You can use materials at the end of their life as well, so particularly steel, which is typically melted down with a huge loss of energy or use of energy and a huge inefficiency. We can start to think of a national Lego kit for putting things back together in different ways, potentially. So that's something I think the modularity and tagging of materials with smart devices can assist.
Lord Wallace now bring the session.
So one of the critical factors, presumably, in getting a more efficient, effective building programs, is for the customers to be educated as to what they should expect, what they should ask for, and so on. I mean, you look at us here in Parliament, and we don't know very much, and yet we're making decisions. Similarly, members of councils and all sorts of industries are making very important decisions about this. So, or for example, you take the original, or Heathrow, or the Olympics. Do you think that more could be done to, as it were, you could say educate or to inform, to show them other countries before they make their decisions? I mean, that's my feeling, is that we haven't done very well in creating intelligent customers, particularly for this area.
I think it's absolutely critical that the people who are making those decisions early know an awful lot about their environment, what they want, that they can see as the actual outcome. They understand how the thing works, how it operates, and I think we sometimes leave these decisions to professional program managers, who are people who are very good at getting things designed and constructed, but we need capable owners, I call them, so a capable owner who can really get behind what this thing's for. I've been fortunate. I've been in fact 20 years at Heathrow. So the people who actually run the buildings, operate them, etc., have to put up with what I've done. And so we have great conversations about wouldn't it be better if, etc. And the learning you get through people understanding how buildings and infrastructure actually operate is fantastic. So I think there's a huge piece to ensure that the
Imperial, this program that you were talking about, does that have an element of teaching, creating intelligent customers?
Well, we'd be keen to work with major infrastructure owners, and we do work with the major projects. So we've been doing work which are the